Hi, this is Craig Stocks. I'm here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And we would love to talk to you about hosting your telescope under our dark southwest Utah skies. If you don't have a telescope that you want to put out for remote imaging, we also allow you to rent time on our telescopes. So if you want to go after a special target, or if you want to try narrowband imaging with monochrome data, or if you just need a longer focal length than you have available, we can be a good source for you to rent some imaging time on our equipment and try your hand at it. So we'd love to talk to you. You can contact us again at utahdesertremote.com. And one of the things I want to do today is go through kind of a before and after of how to process this data of the Blue Horsehead Nebula into this data. And we're going to use a combination of PixInsight and then Photoshop. And probably more of the work is done in Photoshop than in PixInsight. And mostly that's because that's where I'm most familiar from my background as a photographer rather than as an astronomer. But let's switch over to PixInsight, and let me start with a disclaimer by saying that I am a long way from a PixInsight expert. I've only been using it for a couple months. I probably know barely enough to bumble around and get the results I want out of it, but it has been working for me. I've switched from using Deep Sky Stacker to using PixInsight now exclusively. But again, I really just use it as a front end to Photoshop. So I use it for calibration and integration. I do stretches in PixInsight because it has some really good tools for that, but then I move over to Photoshop for all of the finishing work. But let's just walk through the whole workflow on this image from start to finish. And the start was with weighted batch preprocessor, and you can find that under scripts. I have to exit to show you the menu option. So it's under Script, Batch Processing, Weighted Batch Preprocessor, and it automatically saves your settings every time you exit. So even though I've exited, it has saved the settings that I use to integrate the information from the Blue Horsehead. And across the top you can see the different categories of data that we're feeding in. The lights is probably the most important, and these are the red, green, and blue subs that I have at 300 seconds each, red, green, and blue, and PixInsight automatically understands to group them by time and by filter, so it kind of does that for you automatically. And then I also have flats, red, green, and blue, darks, and bias frames, and PixInsight can figure out how to put all that together to do both the integration, and then I also have it set to do calibration as well. So integration is averaging them together and aligning them. Integration actually creates an output image. So I've already run this, so I'm not going to take the time to run it now, but what I would do at this point is first I might check the diagnostics to see if there's any error warning messages, and everything looks okay. And then I would just click on Run, and then PixInsight would go off and run all this, do the work, and save the output files, which I have loaded into PixInsight here. And you can load those files just by double-click on the background, and that gives you the browser to find, in this case, the master light, red, green, and blue, are right here. So I've loaded those, and if I just do a quick screen stretch on the, I think I've got the blue one in front here. This is what the data looks like after I've loaded it. And I've actually done a couple of other things to this. This is still in linear format, and I've done a couple things to get to this point. I've done a dynamic background extraction because there was a little bit of a gradient. And I'm using a process that I saw from Sean Nielsen at visibledark.ca, I believe, and he also has a YouTube channel. Basically using a very relaxed DBE set of settings and samples around the perimeter. And I've had real good luck with this. It just does a nice job of kind of neutralizing any gradients that you have in the background. So I would encourage you to look at those tutorials. And then the next thing I did, I'll cancel this, I also did a linear fit. And you can find that under Process, and I usually just go All Processes, Linear Fit. And what this let me do is pick a reference image, and in this case I picked the blue because I thought the blue data was going to be most important. And then I balanced the red and green to the blue, so it gives me kind of a neutral color balance. So I've also done that in advance of getting to where we're at here. The next thing I want to do is combine these three, red, green, and blue, into a single RGB image. And I'll do that by going to Process and Channel Combination. And what I want to do is map into an RGB color space, red, green, and blue. And you can see for the red, I'm choosing the red data. Green is green, blue is blue. So when I click on the red circle to apply, it will create a new image. And I'm done with this now. So here's our new RGB image. And if I do just again a quick screen stretch on that to see what it looks like, we'll be able to see that we now have a full color RGB image. And that doesn't look too bad. And you can actually apply a screen stretch with the screens transfer function and the histogram transformation functions, and apply this and save it. And that's not a bad starting point. But I'd like to pull out more, especially color in the stars. And I have found a good way to stretch an image, at least an initial stretch, and preserve, if not even enhancing the color in the stars, is with the ArcSine Stretch method. So let me turn off this screen stretch. So we're back to looking at just the linear image. This is an unstretched image. And let's pull up our ArcSine H. And I have just saved some of my common processes over here. And the circle will give me a real-time preview of what my settings are doing. And I will typically crank this almost all the way to the right, and then do an estimate black point. And frequently it does what it has done here. It takes the black point up what I think is going to be a little bit too far. So I can dial this back down a little bit so that we're not clipping any of the black. And you can see that it does a lot of stretch in the nebula, but it is really preserving all of the star color that we didn't have before in the screen stretch. So let's apply this with and I did that just with the square icon. And generally at this point I'm done with the ArcSine Stretch. Even though that's not where I want to end up, it's given me a good starting point, but I want to do a little bit more stretching and even this out a little bit. And I'll do that just kind of by hand with the histogram transformation function. So again, let's apply a real-time preview so we can see what we're doing. And I'm on the RGB stretch, which you can tell because this is gray. And as I grab this center slider and slide it to the left, that will apply some stretch. And you can see I'm starting to get too bright in the background area, so I'm going to grab the black and move it in a little bit and restore some of that black point. But again, I don't want to drive it all the way to black. I want to keep some color there, some tone, and just find what I think is a good compromise between the foreground, the nebula, and the star color. And in particular, I want to preserve the star color. You can always reduce saturation, I think, more easily than you can add saturation. So I'd rather be in a situation of having too much than too little. So at this point, I would apply this, and again, just with the square. And then that stretches this image again into what's pretty much our final image. And you'll notice the preview, the reason it turns so bright is it's applying this again in the preview, which we don't really need to do, so we can close both the transform tool and the preview window. And here's our image that has now been stretched twice. Now the last thing I will do, if we kind of zoom in here, you can see there's a fair amount of noise in here, and there's a wonderful new tool from Russell Cromeland at RC Astro, Noise Exterminator. And right now it only works in PixInsight. And I actually have another version of this image already stretched, so it may look a little bit different. The reason I pulled this up is I have applied the Noise Exterminator and then gone back in time with an undo, and so I can just quickly redo this. So if you watch the noise, that's what Noise Exterminator did. I mean, it's just kind of almost amazing. If we go back and forth, that was before, and that was after. So at this point, I would save this version of the image with the noise reduction, and then the next thing I would do is run, also from RC Astro, Star Exterminator. And what that does is create a starless version of this same image. And I've also already done that. So I now have two saved images. I have this image and I have a starless version of this image that I've saved as 16-bit TIFF files. And it's a little bit dangerous going down to 16-bit at this level, but I've already done the main stretching, the main color balancing, so what I'm going to do going forward is really more fine-tuning than heavy stretching. So I feel fairly comfortable going forward with 16-bit files. If I did load these as 32-bit files into Photoshop, one of the first things I would do is convert them to 16-bit anyway. So let's pop over to Photoshop and look at how we go from that simple screen stretch to this version. So the first thing I'm going to do is load the files that we've created in PixInsight, and to do that I'll go to Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and that gives me this dialog box where I can browse to go find the files that I want to load. And I know they're on my D drive, which is where I save my images that I'm working on. And there's the blue horse head. And these are the two we want to load. The ArcSine H with the Noise Exterminator, and this is also with Star Exterminator. My little shorthand is NXT for Noise Exterminator, SXT for Star Exterminator, and the image that still has stars. It has just the Noise Exterminator run on it. Click OK, and then OK again. And this is just a nice shortcut tool that will load these two files into their own layer in one document. And each layer then will carry the name of the file as the layer name. So once they're done loading, we'll have two layers over here in the layer stack. One for the image with stars, one for the image without stars. You know, it's just a nice, easy shortcut. So there's our starless image, and you can see that Star Exterminator missed a few of the larger stars. And if I turn that layer off by clicking the eyeball, there's our layer with stars. Now the first thing I want to do, because I want a layer with just stars, I need to clean up these stars that Star Exterminator missed. And I'm going to do that with the healing brush tool. And the way the healing brush tool works is a little bit like the clone stamp, only it does a better job of blending the healed area with the surrounding area. And you will alt-click to choose a source point, and then, like the clone stamp, you just paint, and it will blend the source area into the destination area. And sometimes you may have to choose multiple areas and maybe go over it a couple times. And what I'm wanting to do is just clean up these areas that are stars that Star Exterminator missed, plus any other large smudges. I'll clean up this area. Here's kind of a smudge. And then we've got, and I'm occasionally alt-clicking to reset the source point. You can use the left and right bracket keys to make the source point larger or smaller. So just clean these up a little bit. And as you'll see, we'll restore a lot of this. So right now I'm just getting it out of the way. So, almost done. We'll clean up this area. Get a little bigger brush. Hit that. And that's probably good enough for now. So, in order to get just a pure star layer, this layer has no stars on it. This layer has all of the stars on it. So if we subtract everything but the stars from everything including the stars, the difference is the stars. So the way we do that is we will just set the blending mode, which right now is at normal. We'll set this to subtract. And what that does is at every pixel location, it will subtract this value from the value below it. And since we're subtracting a starless version from a starry version, the difference is just the stars. Now, right now we can see this, but it's kind of ephemeral, kind of temporary, because we can only see it because this layer is in subtract blending mode. And as soon as I put this back into normal blending mode, we lose that view. So we need to preserve that. And the way we'll preserve that is just by making a stamped copy of the view at this point. And you can use the menu option stamp visible, or you can use the keyboard shortcut Shift Control Alternate E. And either way you do that, what that did is create a new layer that is a permanent copy of what we were seeing at that time. So let's just label this stars, because that's all that's on this layer. And I'm going to just real quickly Control G to put that into a group, and we'll label the group stars. And we know we're going to want this group, rather than being in normal or pass-through blending mode, we want it to be in linear dodge or add blending mode. And let's just real quickly put this back into normal blending mode. So what we've done now, we've subtracted the stars and then we added the stars back. So the difference is exactly the same. This is the layer with the stars. This is the layer without the stars. And this is the layer with the stars added back. So we basically get right back to where we started. The advantage is now we can process the stars and the background independently. So, in fact, let's turn off the stars and focus on just processing this background. First thing we might want to do is add a levels adjustment, and you'll notice I do everything with an adjustment layer. I never flatten an image, and I won't crop this image until I'm completely done and have loaded it into Lightroom for any final touches. So we can darken the background, we can lighten the light areas. Because we don't have stars to worry about, we can really brighten up the bright areas and add a lot more contrast than we would have had otherwise. Sometimes that will start to drive the color a little bit crazy, so we may need to add a hue saturation. Sometimes you want to add saturation, sometimes you want to reduce it. It just kind of depends on the image. We're starting to see a lot more texture in here. It's not just flat. And if we want to really bring out that texture, we can do that with another layer using the high pass filter. So let's grab just our starless layer. I'm going to duplicate it with Control J, pull it up above my adjustment layers. It looks like I Sometimes when you pull things up and you have a group above it, it will land in the group rather than outside the group. So in fact, let's close that star group so that we don't have it open. And I want to do two things to use the high pass filter. The first thing I want to do is remove all the color so that we're not getting weird color effects. So we want to just simply desaturate this, and there's a keyboard shortcut for that, Shift Control U. But really all I'm doing is desaturating. You could also do it with a hue saturation adjustment. Just turn this into a monochrome image. Now we'll go to Filter, Other, High Pass Filter. And what High Pass Filter does is let us play with a radius, and that radius will determine how much it will accentuate edges. If I run this up fairly high, the higher I go, the kind of the larger areas that are affected by the high pass filter. And you can kind of see in the preview here how it's starting to lighten one side of an edge and darken the other side. And that's really what we want it to do to accentuate some of this texture. So let's just click OK. So that looks pretty ugly, but the way we have this affect the images below it is, again, by changing the blending mode to either soft light or overlay. And soft light is not quite as aggressive, overlay is a little bit more aggressive, and I think this image can probably tolerate the overlay. So now we have a lot of texture showing up in here, and that's because of this high pass filter. It doesn't really add any sharpness, it just adds a little bit of a highlight shadow edge along any edges so that they become more obvious. And if we turn our stars on now, you can see that we're starting to have a lot more texture visible through the stars. The stars are still getting in the way a little bit, so let's go up to our star layer, and I'll click on the star layer itself and then add a levels adjustment above that. And we can minimize the impact of the stars now by changing their brightness. And we can even pull down if we pull the dark slider to the right, we're making the blacks blacker or the darks darker. And you can see when I do that, that makes the stars smaller. But at some point you start getting dark rings around the star. So you want to be careful you don't go so far that you start getting a lot of dark rings. You can usually be a little bit more effective with the middle slider by darkening it. And sometimes you may even want to add a little bit to the white slider, pulling it to the left to bring in a little bit more pop. So we can adjust those, and if we want to adjust the color balance of just the stars, we could add a color balance layer, for instance, and change the color balance of the stars if we need more red or more blue. We could also even add saturation to the stars to get the stars to be even more colorful. And all of this, because it's in the group labeled stars, you can think of what happens in the group stays in the group. Everything here is only affecting that star layer and nothing else. And if we turn it on and off, you can see that. Now, you'll probably notice there's some kind of flat, funky areas going on up here around this bright star. That's fairly common around the brightest stars in the image. And so the way we're going to deal with that is we're going to come down here and grab this original image. And if I alt-click on the eyeball, that will show us just that layer by itself. We really want to bring back some of this original image here and also over here around this smaller reflection nebula. The way we're going to do that is we're going to bring this layer up to the very top, even above the stars. And again, we're going to drop it into a group so we can do things with it without it affecting things below. And we're going to put this into darken blending mode. And then we will throw a levels adjustment on that. And I know I want to primarily affect this area around this star. So I'm going to add a layer mask, and by holding the alternate key when I add the layer mask, that will add the layer mask as black instead of white. So now this whole group is having no effect. I'm going to grab the brush tool by tapping the B key. I've got white as my foreground color, and let's tap 0 to make the opacity 100%. And I'll just put a big white circle on the mask right there. So that's now this layer in darken blending mode is affecting what's below. And you can see that got rid of that dark circle, but now it's a little bit too dark. Fortunately, we have our levels adjustment here. We can brighten this up and find a spot where it just kind of fits in perfectly and replaces what was there with something that's, doesn't have that dark circle around it. And if we turn this group off and back on, we can see the effect it had. And if we want to brighten up that area even more, let's tweak this a little bit. If we want to brighten this area even more, let's add a layer at the very top. And since I had a group, my active layer was the group. When I added this blank layer, it added inside the group. That's kind of default Photoshop behavior that you need to look out for. We really want it to be above the group, so I'll move it up to the very top of the layer stack. And again, I'm going to put this in soft light blending mode. And what soft light blending mode does is it lets you, if you paint on it in either white or black, it will either lighten or darken what's below. And generally you do this at fairly low opacity, so I'm going to change my opacity to 10% just by tapping the 1 key. I'll tap D for my default colors, and I can switch black and white just by tapping the X key. So now white is my foreground color. I have 10% opacity, 100% flow, and if I just click over here, you can see it's adding some brightness. And I've clicked over here 3 or 4 times now, adding some brightness to this area, kind of as a final addition. Let's come back to our layer mask over here, and let's do the same thing. Let's paint with white so that we're adding this base layer back over top, and then we'll add a little brightness to this area. And this star actually should have more yellow in it typically. If you want to add some color locally, you can grab a color. You can even grab it directly from the color swatch tool. In this case, we just grab some yellow, again at 10% opacity. And if I just paint with yellow on this soft light layer, that will add a little bit of color in here. That last one went just a little too far. So if I turn this layer off and on, you can see the effect that it's having. And in fact, you can spend as much time as you want with a layer like this. If I want to bring out a little bit more of the nebulosity in this area, I can paint again with like a 10% opacity and brighten that area locally. If I want to darken some of the area around the nebula to help it stand out, I can paint with black, and that darkens, so we're darkening the dark areas and brightening the light areas, and that creates that local contrast that helps an image pop. So you can spend as much or as little time as you want experimenting with brightening and darkening different areas, but it's a good way to help an image really stand out. Kind of an old landscape photography or portrait retouching trick. So at this point we have made a lot of progress. We have all of our layers still intact. We have If I zoom in a little bit, we have nice, bright, colorful stars that we were able to manage separately from the background, so that we have good visibility of the layer below with the nebula, and also good colorful stars on top. And we can still come back and fine-tune the individual stars after the fact. So if we go to our star layer levels, this is really the main adjustment on how big we want the stars to be. Do we want it to be real small, real large, or somewhere in between? And just by pulling that middle slider back and forth, you can, within reasonable limits, you can make the stars have as much presence as you want them to have. So at this point, I would save the image as it is, as a 16-bit image with all layers intact, and I will save that as a PSB file. So when you go to File, Save As, and now I will save it in my master files. I will save this as a PSB, which is Photoshop's large document format. Give it a nice descriptive name, and click Save, and Photoshop will do its save. Generally at this point I will load the image into Lightroom, so let's just pop into Lightroom real quick. And we're going to actually be looking at a previous version of this. And let me go to the develop settings, and let's just do a quick reset, because there's a few interesting things you can do in Lightroom that are real easy to do. So if I click on reset in the develop module, that just resets it back to the way it was when I first loaded it in. I like to look at the histogram first, and we can see that the black areas are not quite fully black. So we may want to pull the blacks down a little bit to give a little bit more contrast. You can only show light relative to dark, and the brighter your blacks are, the less you're going to be able to differentiate the light areas from the dark areas. We may want to lighten the light areas a little bit. We can kind of play with the whites and the highlights and shadows to get an overall global view. I typically will go to Detail, and I'll do two things here. Sharpening, you hear a lot about deconvolution sharpening. In Lightroom, if I apply some sharpening and then I move the radius all the way to the left, detail all the way to the right, that is deconvolution sharpening. And then you can change the amount of sharpening with the sharpening slider. And the masking slider is really neat because I can limit the sharpening to be just in the brighter areas. So what this masking does is I move it to the right, it masks the dark areas so that I'm only sharpening the bright areas, which would be the stars and the nebula. And then I typically will also add some luminance noise reduction. This is where I would do my crop. Something else of interest we can do, if we go back to the basic panel, and of course we can fine-tune if we want to adjust the color balance. We can play with the color balance here. We have a couple presence sliders. We have texture, clarity, and dehaze. And in that order, they work on smaller, medium, and larger details. So dehaze tends to accentuate the edge contrast of the larger features. Texture is the smallest, and clarity is kind of in between. And as you play with those, sometimes you'll find they do good things or not so good things. For instance, negative texture does a nice job of kind of minimizing and softening the stars, but I like that more around the perimeter than I do in the middle. Dehaze sometimes will bring out a lot more texture in a nebula, but also negative dehaze will bring out nebula in faint areas and help it show up. So if you look at the nebula kind of down here and around the edges, negative dehaze does a nice job. So let's do a couple things. Let's add a radial filter. And to start with, I'm going to just draw out an ellipse here over the center. And you can, by inverting it, you can decide whether you want this filter to affect inside the circle, or if I uncheck invert, it will affect outside the circle. Let's start with inside the ellipse here. And let me turn off the overlay. Let's add some clarity and a little bit of dehaze. And we'll bring up the highlights even more, and maybe even a little bit more saturation in this area. And with blue, often when you add saturation, you need to brighten it a little bit. So that does generally some nice things here inside the ellipse. Let's add a new elliptical adjustment. And again, I'm going to draw out a good size ellipse. This time I'm going to uncheck invert, so it's affecting the area outside the ellipse. And now let's do a little bit of negative texture and even a little bit of negative dehaze, which will kind of soften and help bring out some of that peripheral nebulosity. And we may want to play with some of the white slider to, again, kind of tweak how we want the stars to look. And maybe something like that looks pretty good. So at this point is now the point where I would crop. I have a pretty much finished image. Now I would go to the crop tool, and this is where I would decide, do I want this to be a 4:5 aspect ratio? Do I want a square aspect ratio and something that focuses just on the nebulosity, like that? Do I want a 16:9? And if it comes up vertical, you can just tap the X key to exchange that to the horizontal crop. This makes an appropriate aspect ratio for instance, a screensaver or your computer wallpaper, and maybe something like that. And the last thing I would do then is export this as a JPEG from Lightroom, and I would do that simply by going back to the library module, click on export, and you can save export recipes. I have one saved that saves this as a 1920 pixel wide TIFF file, and it even adds my watermark. So when I click export, it will export that, and if it already exists, it asks, do I want to use unique names or overwrite the original? I'll just go ahead and overwrite the original. And that's how I go from the raw data in PixInsight, doing the inverse hyperbolic sine or ArcSine H stretch function, and then a histogram transformation. Save that in both star and starless versions, applying noise exterminator and star exterminator. And then in Photoshop, by working with the different layers so that I can adjust the nebula in the background separately from the stars in the foreground to create a almost finished image, and then finish the image in Lightroom and save the final image. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I hope you found this helpful. Be sure to check us out online at utahdesertremote.com, and we would love to talk to you about hosting your equipment under our dark skies in southwest Utah. And with that, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under clear dark skies. Thanks.